Imagine that we had a 6 by 12 chessboard that looked like this. In one corner, we have a white queen. In the opposite corner, we have a black king. In this game, the king does not move. Instead, we will take turns moving the queen. And specifically, we must move the queen up, right, or diagonally in every move. That is, no cowardice is allowed. We have to move every turn, and we have to move toward the king. The person who captures the king wins. To make things a little more interesting, the king has a bodyguard, a black pawn that is right there. Generally speaking, this pawn will not move, except to capture the queen, and will automatically do so if the queen lands on any of its capture zones, which for this particular game will be diagonally downward from that pawn. If you put the queen into a position where she can be captured, and she will be captured, you lose. Each player is allowed to capture the pawn, but that doesn't do anything special. You still have to capture the king to win. To recap the rules, we will take turns moving the queen up, right, or upright. The pawn will only move to capture diagonally downward one space, and the king does not move. You're going first. Your puzzle for today is to design a strategy that guarantees you the victory. And while you think about that, check out some of these cool books that I've written. Your hint for today is to apply backward induction, a topic I cover in Chapter 2 of Game Theory 101, the complete textbook. In other words, you should start toward the end of this game, think about what moves are good or bad at that point, and use that information to inform potentially good or bad moves earlier on. Are you ready for the solution? If not, here's a hint. Your opening move is to take the queen to d1. Any other move will result in you losing with optimal play from your opponent. Okay, here comes the answer. As the hint suggested, the easiest way of solving this is to start by thinking about what moves could end the game. There are two that are right off the bat. If you let the queen get captured, you lose. And there are two capture zones from the pawn. Thus, you do not want to place the queen on either of those red squares at the end of your turn. There are also a few different indirect ways where you would automatically lose as well. Think about anywhere in row 6 or column L. If you place the queen on any of those squares, then on your opponent's next turn, they can immediately capture the king. As such, landing on any of those red squares, be they in row 6 or column L, are automatic losses, and thus you must avoid them. It's also not a good idea to capture the pawn, because then your opponent just moves diagonally one square and wins. Interestingly, this means that it does not matter whether the king were capable of capturing or not. Any of the squares that are next to the king are bad to land on regardless. Having done this work so far, do you see any good places to land on? In fact, there are two. Think about J5 and K4. If you land on either of those squares to end your turn, you will eventually win the game. Think about J5 for a moment. There are only three places your opponent can move on their turn: J6, K6, or K5. You'll notice that all three of those options are shaded in red. That means if your opponent lands there, you'll be able to win as a result. Thus, this game isn't so much about landing on L6 to capture the king, so much as it is to land on J5. It's the same story with K4. There are only 3 legal moves that can follow that: K5, L4, and L5. All 3 of those will force your opponent to lose for one reason or another. As such, you can win the game by forcing a move that lands onto K4 on your turn. Continuing with the backward induction procedure, do you see any new squares that you should not land on? Think about J5 for a minute. If you land on any square that would allow your opponent to move to J5, you will lose. That's because we figured out that one way to win the game is to land on J5. Consequently, the entire rest of row 5 is a no-go zone. If you were to land there, your opponent goes to J5 and ultimately wins. It's the same thing with the rest of column J. Your opponent can move up to J5, and that would be the end of the game. And because we're looking at a queen, and queens can move diagonally, that also means that the diagonal that leads to J5 is another set of no-go squares. We can give K4 the same treatment. All of the remaining squares in row 4 or column K are no-go zones, and so is the diagonal that leads up to K4. Having done that, can you now see another square that is safe to land on? How about I3? Everything above it, to the right of it, or diagonal from it is shaded in red. As such, no matter what your opponent would do from this square, they're forced to ultimately lose, which means you can win simply by landing on I3. But that tells us a bunch of new squares that you cannot land on. Anything in row 3, column I, or diagonal toward I3 would allow your opponent to land onto I3 on their turn, and thereby cause you to lose. As such, all of those squares are red. How about now? Do you see any new safe squares? Check out F2. Everything directly above it, to the right of it, or diagonal from it is shaded red. Thus, no matter how your opponent moves from F2, you will win. And in turn, you want to land on F2. That also means that anything in row 2 or diagonal leading to F2 is a no-go zone. And from here, we can deduce the optimal opening move for you, which is to head over to D1. If you go to D1, everything directly above it, to the right of it, or diagonal from it is red, and thus you will win by landing on D1. This also means that landing on B1 or C1 with your opening move will not win, because your opponent could instead go to D1. Did you figure this one out? Let me know in the comments. And if you enjoyed this video, please like, share, and subscribe, and I'll see you next time. Take care.